Steve, I, like most people, have been fascinated by the paranormal, parapsychology, ESP my entire life. Now, I don't know whether any of this stuff is real at all, but I want to know that if it's real, even if 1% or 1% of 1% is real, what does it tell us about the nature of reality?
As far as I'm concerned, the field of parapsychology and the realm of the paranormal deal with just a handful of basic phenomena. One would be telepathy, which would be a kind of mind-to-mind interaction. Another would be clairvoyance, which would be the impact of some physical state of affairs on an individual's mental states. Another may not be different, but another might be considered precognition, which would be the influence of the apparent influence of some future state of affairs on some earlier mental state. Another would be psychokinesis, or roughly mind over matter. And finally, there would be survival of bodily death. Now, I think the easiest way, perhaps, to understand the implications of a worldview in which these sorts of phenomena might occur would be to look at psychokinesis. Suppose I could move by thought alone, say, a matchstick, and move it just a millimeter. Now, it's a very small step conceptually from being able to do that to being able to make somebody drop dead by thought alone.
Sure.
So the existence of any psychokinesis at all forces us, I think, to take seriously what most would consider to be a magical worldview, which, again, most of us associate, usually condescendingly, only with so-called primitive cultures.
Animism.
Yes. But more important, it's a worldview in which our thoughts can have lethal consequences or other undesired consequences, and for which we might have to take responsibility for a range of occurrences that most of us would just as soon be bystanders for. So if I have a vagrant thought about somebody and then that person has an accident, most of us in the West, at any rate, aren't very comfortable with the idea that our negative thought might have actually played a role causally in that person's misfortune. And so I think one of the terrifying aspects of the worldview implied by psychic phenomena is just this, that it suggests our participation and our influence in a range of events that most of us would just as soon keep our distance from.
All the categories you talked about, the strangest would seem to be precognition, in having something in the future affect us today, or us knowing the future, either the event in the future having some retro effect on us now, or us seeing in a precognitive sense there. That seems to distort all our sense of space-time as we know it today.
Precognition needn't be so disturbing, although no matter how you look at it, it's going to be a little disturbing if it really occurs.
This is all disturbing, by the way.
I understand. But we'll look at it this way. There are two basic ways to analyze apparent precognition. One would be the one you suggested, the retrocausal analysis, so that, say, a plane crash tomorrow causes an earlier dream of a plane crash. But that's only one option. Another option might be what Jules Eisenbud called the active analysis. And here we have several sub-options. Let me give you an analogy to start. Suppose I'm an engineer and I'm looking at a building, I'm examining a building under construction, I look at the blueprints and so on, and then I go home and I fall asleep, I take a nap, and I have a dream of the building collapsing. And I wake up and think to myself, God Almighty, the building is going to collapse. Now, that's analogous to the way in which certain apparent precognitive experiences occur. But what we would say in that case is that the engineer's dream was based on real-time information gathered, which he then synthesized, and the inference bubbled up while he was sleeping. Now, there's a psychic analog to that. Let's suppose that somebody has real-time information gathered by psychic scanning, ESP, and simply draws an inference. This would be a kind of psi-mediated inference, which leads to a prediction which apparently is realized in the future.
So that's not really seeing the future, but having what I think you've called super psi, so that you really have a tremendous access to information beyond the senses in the present.
Yes.
So that you're able to synthesize a highly likely or some probability of the future.
That's one option. Another would be that we actually bring about the event in the future. Now, that doesn't have to mean, for example, that if we dream about a plane crashing, we had to have such massive psychokinesis that we produce an explosion. It might just mean that we had to affect just the right little thing at the right point to have resulted in the explosion. Right. That's terrifying in its own way. One advantage of the active analysis over the retrocausal analysis has to do with the paradox of the retrocausal understanding of precognition. It's often called the intervention paradox. So suppose I have a genuine precognition of a plane crashing tomorrow, and I then take steps to prevent the plane crashing. If that's the case, then how could it be that an event which didn't occur caused me to have the dream? The active analysis avoids that apparent paradox.
Okay, let's now discuss the reality or non-reality of all of these phenomena, any of this phenomena that's ESP, which is clearly gathering information that is beyond the normal senses and probably beyond any sort of physical senses as we anywhere near understand them. What is your confidence level in the existence of it, recognizing that a huge number is fraud and illusion and delusion and all that, and put that aside? But do you have high confidence that there is some reality here?
I personally believe that there are some apparently paranormal phenomena that are genuinely paranormal, that can't be explained away in any sort of familiar terms that science has proposed up till now.
And I'm not going to argue the point. It is argued by many people, and that's not the point here. I want to say, okay, let's go to the next step, that if you really believe that to be the case, do you believe that the way that that happens, the cause, the mechanisms that occur, are an enhanced view of the physical world that we don't know yet, or it must be something that cannot even be categorized as physical in principle?
I would say that some psychic phenomena are clearly mediated by physical goings-on.
Oh, sure. I'm saying the ultimate causation of them.
I'm not sure I know how to answer that, in the same way that I wouldn't be sure I know how to answer the question, is volition or is memory caused along the same lines?
Let me try to ask it in a negative sense. Would you believe that these phenomena can, in principle, in some future date, be explained entirely in the physical world of forces and particles?
I'm not sure that that's the case. And one reason is there's evidence suggesting that some people's personalities or some part of their consciousness survives bodily death. And that suggests that at least conventional physical explanations have to be tossed out the window.
Certainly, if that's true. But let's put aside survival after death. The core paranormal phenomena of extrasensory perception and clairvoyance, and then precognition as it may fit into these other categories. Do you think those phenomena can be explained in principle in some future date entirely by the forces and particles and stuff of the physical world?
To the extent the phenomena have to be described in more or less familiar folk psychological or ordinary psychological terms, no, they will not be explained entirely in physical terms. There may be a physical component to it.
Well, sure, they would be manifested in physical component. Everything has to be, or we wouldn't know anything about it. So.
Well, look, I think ordinary verbal communication can't be reduced to purely physical processes, though verbal communication has to be understood in terms of things people write, people say, and so on. But to the extent that verbal communication involves explaining how one person's thoughts are conveyed successfully to another person, if thoughts can't be explained in terms of what's going on in somebody's head, then that's never going to be explained fully in physical terms.
So integrating it all together, would you say the existence of these phenomena give you a sense of a world beyond the physical? Would you say that? Or are you saying there are just different categories of psychology within the current physical world?
To some extent, I'd say the apparent existence of psychokinesis and ESP doesn't pose any problems for the philosophy of mind different from those posed by the existence of memory and volition and other ordinary psychological processes. However, to the extent that they suggest that there are physical goings-on which are radically different from those which we understand right now, to suggest that one person's intention could levitate a table, for instance, there, I think, there will be an impact on our scientific worldview as we know it.
Okay, let's say I believe that these phenomena are real, or at least some aspect of it. How could it happen? What are the different ways that people use to possibly explain it?
Some people think you can explain paranormal phenomena, assuming they're genuine, in more or less conventional scientific terms by some extension of contemporary physics. Others would say...
Such as quantum mechanics and
yes,
arrows of time and space-time and...
whatever. There are certainly physicists working within parapsychology who think we don't need to go beyond the categories inherited in present-day physics to accommodate these. We just have to figure out exactly how to do it. Others would say that we need to revert to some radical, non-physical realm in order to explain all of them. I steer a kind of middle course there. I would say if the evidence for survival of bodily death is concerned, standard physical explanations could go out the window. But as far as ordinary ESP and psychokinesis are concerned, the picture is a little more complicated. I mean, look, if we understand what it means to say, for example, that because Johnny was angry, he did such and such. We have to explain Johnny's actions and his effect on the physical world in part in terms of his anger. Now, let's suppose that psychokinetically we can produce things, as in poltergeist cases, in terms of somebody's anger or emotional distress. There's a psychological component to the phenomenon, which I would say simply in virtue of its being described appropriately in ordinary psychological terms cannot be reduced to any sort of conventional physical explanation. But there may nevertheless be some component of the phenomenon of PK, psychokinesis, or poltergeist phenomena, or of ESP that would involve some extension of present-day science as we know it, to account for that part of the phenomenon, not for the part that's describable only and appropriately in psychological terms. That part will be forever beyond the domain of physics.
But that doesn't have to posit some existence of spirits and worlds beyond this one.
No, it doesn't.
So, in essence, there are three views. One, a purely physical view involving very exotic aspects of physics, as it may or may not happen. The other is a postulating spiritual realms and existence and worlds and beings and all sorts of things mediating. And your view would be, I'm not sure I'd put it in the middle, I'd put it as a third view, someplace in this constellation.
Fair enough.
And that would be that our psychological states that produce these things cannot be reduced, but they may be mediated by the normal physical process, normal quote unquote.
Or maybe unusual and as yet undiscovered. But I mean, the key point, I think, is that on the kind of view that I would push for, we need to understand that human beings are, generally speaking, more remarkable creatures than we like to give them credit for, that we have within us capacity for a range of performances, psychic and non-psychic, that most people, or many people at least, aren't willing to countenance.